A prisoner on death row harbors a secret that could bring down one of the country's most powerful businessmen. But when he decides to reveal it in his final hours, his lawyer uncovers a truth that could cost him everything. How far would you go for justice? The ringing of the phone broke the silence in Marcos' office. The lawyer, immersed in the review of a trivial case, hesitated before answering. It was late, and calls after hours almost never brought good news. When he picked up the receiver, a serious and firm voice came in. It was the director of the state penitentiary. "Mr. Marcos, I am sorry to bother you at this hour, but Miguel Hernandez, your former client, has asked to see you. He says it is urgent. He will be executed tomorrow and he wants to speak to you before the time comes." Marcos felt a pang in his chest. Miguel. That name he had avoided mentioning since the trial that ended with the prisoner's death sentence. Years had passed since then, and although he had tried to convince himself that he had done everything possible to defend him, he could never get rid of the shadow of doubt. "Did he say why he wanted to see me?" Marcos asked, trying to maintain his composure. "He just mentioned that he has something important to tell you, something that can't wait." Mark remained silent for a few moments. His first reaction was to reject the proposal. He didn't see what could change at this point. However, curiosity began to grow within him. Finally, he accepted. That same night, Marcos arrived at the penitentiary. The cold lights of the place and the echo of his footsteps in the corridors reinforced the feeling of desolation. They led him to a small visiting room. Miguel was already there, sitting, with his hands cuffed on the metal table. When their gazes met, Marcos was surprised to notice something in Miguel's eyes. It wasn't fear or resignation, but an intense determination that was almost disturbing. "Thank you for coming, Marcos," Miguel said in a calm but emotional voice. "I was told you had something important to tell me," Marcos replied, taking a seat across from him. Miguel nodded slowly, his eyes locked with the lawyer's. "What I'm going to tell you can't stay here. It's something I've kept to myself for years, and if I don't say it now, no one will ever know." Marcos tilted his head, intrigued. Miguel took a deep breath before continuing. "I am not guilty of the crime for which I was convicted." Translated from Spanish to English, www.onlinedoctrinslator.com. The statement fell like a stone on Marcos's mind. For a moment, he didn't know how to react. He had heard many clients declare their innocence, even when the evidence was overwhelming. However, something in Miguel's tone made him hesitate. "Why are you telling me this now, Miguel? Your sentence is irrevocable. There is nothing I can do to change it." "Because the truth matters," Miguel replied firmly, "and because there is something you need to know before it is too late." Marcos watched him in silence, trying to decipher the meaning behind those words. The intensity in Miguel's eyes had not diminished. On the contrary, it seemed like he was willing to risk everything to make sure he was heard. "I'm here to listen," Marcos finally said, without taking his eyes off the prisoner. Miguel nodded again, and with a crushing seriousness concluded, "The truth is not as simple as it seems. You need to know what really happened." Time seemed to have stopped in that room. Although he wasn't sure what Miguel was going to say to him, Marcos felt like he had crossed a point of no return. Marcos crossed his arms and leaned forward, watching Miguel's every move. There was something different about his posture, the way he spoke, almost as if he were lifting an unbearable weight. "Tell me, Miguel, what do I need to know?" the lawyer asked, in a tone that was somewhere between skeptical and curious. Miguel took a deep breath, as if he were about to dive into deep water. "I am not guilty of the murder. I never was. I accepted the blame because someone very close to me needed it." Silence filled the room. Marcos stared at him, trying to process his former client's words. He had seen many desperate strategies in the past, but something in Miguel's voice resonated with authenticity. "Who is that person?" he asked, keeping calm despite the whirlwind of emotions that was beginning to form inside him. "I can't tell you yet, but I can tell you details that you didn't know about during the trial. Details that never came to light because I made sure to hide them." Marcos frowned, trying to recall the evidence presented at that trial. It had been a complex case, with circumstantial evidence that, while strong, always left a slightly bitter taste in his mouth. "I'm listening," he finally said. Miguel tilted his head, his gaze grave. "On the night of the murder, I was not at the scene of the crime. I was with someone else, someone you and the prosecution did not mention. That person can corroborate that I was not the one who fired the shots. Why didn't you mention it before? We could have used that for your defense, Marcos replied, surprised, because that person would have been destroyed if the ties he had with the victim were discovered. I couldn't allow that, Miguel confessed, lowering his voice as if he feared someone else might hear him. The lawyer sat back in his chair, trying to process the revelation. A mixture of frustration and bewilderment began to wash over him. He had spent weeks, months, building a defense that had ultimately failed, and now Miguel was saying he had withheld crucial information. This is absurd, Miguel. If there is evidence that exonerates you, you should have presented it years ago. It is too late now, Marcos said, although his tone lacked the conviction he intended. Is it too late for the truth, Marcos? Maybe it is too late for me, but not for the one who really deserves to be here. That person is free, living his life without consequences. I accepted this fate, but now I can't take it anymore. I want the world to know the truth, even if it's after I die. Miguel lowered his gaze, but his tone remained firm. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for justice. Mark studied him closely. There was something in those words that struck him as genuine, something that began to erode the disbelief he had felt since the beginning of the conversation. If this is true, how do you expect me to help you now? There is no time, Miguel, she said, although doubt was beginning to creep into her mind. I want you to investigate. You have the resources, the connections. There are things you can find out even now. Please do it for the truth. The lawyer let out a heavy sigh, his thoughts tangled. Miguel had planted a seed of uncertainty in him, and he knew he wouldn't be able to rest tonight until he revisited every detail of the case. Before leaving, Miguel added, "When you start looking, you will find more than you imagine." Marcos left the room with a strange feeling. Something inside him had ignited, a spark of unease that he couldn't ignore. Back in his office, Marcos couldn't get Miguel's words out of his head. Although he tried to convince himself that it was all a ruse by a desperate man, something in his former client's look and tone made him uneasy. What if he had really failed in his role as a defender? He turned on his desk lamp and opened the case file. It was a voluminous dossier filled with statements, evidence, and the notes he himself had taken during the trial. Each page seemed to bear the weight of a tragedy that was now resurfacing. Miguel's conviction had been swift. He had confessed from the beginning and had refused to cooperate with any defense strategy that might benefit him. Although Marcos had done his best to question the circumstantial evidence, the confession was final. Now, looking through those documents, he was beginning to notice details that had previously seemed insignificant. For example, she recalled the lack of hard physical evidence. There were no fingerprints from Miguel on the murder weapon and no witnesses who saw him at the crime scene. It had all been based on his confession and a series of circumstantial evidence that seemed to fit, but now, with the years behind them, seemed less solid. Marcos stopped at a key point in the case: the testimony of the neighbor who supposedly heard the shots. At the time, that statement had been crucial, but when he read it again, he noticed something he had overlooked. The woman had not seen Miguel at the scene. She only claimed to have heard a voice similar to his. How did I not notice this before? He muttered to himself, feeling a pang of frustration. As she continued to look, other details began to stand out. There were vague mentions of a second man seen near the crime scene, but those leads were never fully investigated. At the time, it had all seemed irrelevant in the face of Miguel's confession. Now, those loose ends seemed to come to life. Marcos leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Miguel's words echoed in his mind. I am not guilty. What if it was true? What if he had failed in his duty to seek the truth, blinded by the apparent simplicity of the case? The lawyer stood up and walked to the window. The city was calm, but his mind was in a state of increasing chaos. He had dedicated his life to justice, and the possibility of having contributed to a wrongful conviction was gnawing at him. But he also knew that reopening the case could have consequences. If he started digging and found nothing, he would not only put his reputation at risk, but also raise hopes for a man who was about to die. But if Miguel was telling the truth, could he live with that burden for the rest of his life? Finally, he made a decision. He turned on his computer and began searching for additional information. A lot of time had passed since the trial, but perhaps there were still threads he could follow. As he looked through old articles and statements related to the case, a new question popped into his mind. Who was the person Miguel was protecting? If he could uncover that connection, he might be able to get to the bottom of the truth. With each document he read, his doubts grew. Something didn't fit. A door he himself had closed years ago was opening, and although he didn't know what he would find on the other side, he was determined to continue investigating. Before closing the night, he looked at the clock. It was 3 in the morning, but time didn't seem relevant. He had taken the first step towards something that would change not only his perception of the case, but also his life. The next morning, with the exhaustion still visible on his face, Marcos decided to return to the penitentiary to confront Miguel. He had spent the night reviewing the case and accumulating questions that only the prisoner could answer. He was determined to get more details, especially about the person Miguel mentioned protecting. Entering the parlor, he found Miguel sitting there, with the same calm but intense expression he had noticed the night before. Marcos sat down opposite him and, without beating around the bush, got straight to the point. "I need you to be clear with me, Miguel. If you want me to do something with the information you gave me, I need names. I can't work with innuendos." Miguel remained silent for a few seconds, as if he were weighing the weight of his words before releasing them. Finally, he bowed his head and replied, "Okay, I'll tell him. The name he's looking for is Alberto Ruiz." Marcos felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that name. Alberto Ruiz was a renowned, influential, and charismatic businessman, known for his charitable contributions and his impeccable reputation. He was the kind of person no one would associate with a crime. "Alberto Ruiz," Marcos repeated, incredulous. "The businessman?" Miguel nodded slowly. "Yes, he did. We were childhood friends. We grew up in the same neighborhood. We shared dreams and problems. But our lives took different paths. While he rose in the business world, I was stuck on a dead end." Marcos laced his fingers together, trying to process what he had just heard. How is Alberto involved in all of this? Miguel sighed and leaned forward, as if each word cost him enormous effort. He was the one who planned it all. The murder was his idea, his solution to a problem that threatened to destroy his career. I was just the pawn who decided to sacrifice everything to protect him. Alberto knew that if anyone had to go down, I would be the one. He had nothing to lose. Marcos felt his disbelief begin to give way at the possibility that Miguel was telling the truth. There was something painfully sincere in his words, something he couldn't ignore. "Why did you agree to this, Miguel? Why take on such a serious burden for him?" Marcos asked, his tone a mixture of curiosity and reproach. "Because I owed him a lot," Miguel replied, his voice cracking slightly. "When we were young, Alberto helped me out of trouble more times than I can count. He gave me opportunities I didn't deserve. When it came time to return the favor, I couldn't say no." Marcos leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the truth grow heavier. If Miguel was telling the truth, they were not only facing injustice, but also a system that had been manipulated by someone with resources and influence. "Do you have proof of this?" he finally asked. Miguel shook his head. "Not directly. All I have are the memories and the certainty that if you start digging, you will find something." Alberto was always careful, but no one can hide everything forever. Marcos let out a heavy sigh. He was entering dangerous territory. If what Miguel said was true, facing someone like Alberto wouldn't be easy. But if he didn't do anything, how could he live with the doubt? "Okay, Miguel, I'll investigate. But you need to tell me everything you remember, every detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem." Miguel nodded, his face showing a mixture of relief and resignation. "Thank you, Marcos. This is all I wanted before my end comes." As Marcos walked out of the penitentiary, a new feeling washed over him. It was no longer just a matter of curiosity or professionalism. Now it was about the truth, a truth he could not ignore, no matter the risks. Back in his office, Marcos knew he was entering dangerous territory. Alberto Ruiz was no ordinary man. His influence extended far beyond his public reputation as a successful businessman. Marcos had to be careful, but also quick. Miguel's execution was just days away. The first step was to review Alberto's connections to the case. He re-examined court documents, witness statements, and police reports. There were vague references that didn't catch his attention during the trial, mentions of a mysterious associate of the victim, links to shady business dealings, and rumors about bribes to local officials. Nothing pointed directly to him, but a shadow was beginning to form behind the events. Marcos decided to investigate beyond the official files. He contacted former colleagues and journalists who worked on the case, looking for any clue that could lead him to Alberto. In those conversations, one name repeatedly came up: Julio Vargas, a former employee of Alberto's who had been abruptly fired months before the crime. The first meeting with Julio was not easy. The man, a retired mechanic with hands hardened by years of work, seemed reluctant to talk. However, when he mentioned Miguel and the case, his eyes filled with concern. "I know more than I should about that," he muttered, lowering his voice as if afraid someone would overhear. "I need your help, Julio. Miguel is about to be executed for something he says he didn't do. If you know something, now is the time to say it," Marcos insisted. After a few moments of hesitation, Julio finally spoke. He recounted how Alberto had changed dramatically in the years leading up to the crime. He had been involved in shady dealings and hanging out with people who did not fit his public image. More importantly, he confirmed that he had seen Alberto meet privately with the victim weeks before the murder. They were tense discussions. "I never heard much, but there was clearly money and threats involved," Julio said, looking at Marcos with concern. The lawyer wrote down each word, feeling like he was beginning to put pieces of the puzzle together. However, he knew that this would not be enough. He needed something more concrete, something that could be presented as evidence. Determined to continue, Marcos looked for financial information on Alberto. He hired a private investigator to track suspicious bank transactions and possible connections to the victim. The results came quickly: large and frequent transfers to unknown accounts just before and after the murder. Although they did not prove anything directly, they reinforced the possibility of a cover-up. The investigation, however, did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, as he was leaving his office, Marcos noticed a car following him from a distance. At first, he thought it was paranoia, but when he took alternative routes and saw that the vehicle persisted, he knew it was no coincidence. That same night, she received an anonymous call. The voice, low and menacing, made the message clear: "Stop snooping around where you're not wanted. You don't know who you're messing with." Marcos hung up, feeling a knot in his stomach. He knew that facing someone like Alberto would bring risks, but now he was aware that he was being watched. Despite the fear, he decided not to stop. The truth he had discovered so far only motivated him to continue forward. Miguel had sacrificed his life for someone who didn't deserve it, and Marcos couldn't stand by and watch that happen. He knew that time was his greatest enemy, but he also understood that he was getting closer to uncovering something big. The next day, with the documents he had collected and the statements he managed to obtain, he began planning his next move. The road would be difficult, but he was determined to continue investigating, no matter the consequences. Marcos knew he could not waste any more time. With the preliminary evidence and statements he had gathered, he decided to file an emergency motion to request a stay of Miguel's execution. Although he knew the chances were slim, he also understood that every second gained was crucial to unearthing the truth. He prepared the document throughout the night, detailing the inconsistencies of the case and exposing the new clues that suggested the possible involvement of Alberto Ruiz. He included Julio Vargas' statement and suspicious financial transactions. However, when he handed it over to the local court, the response was cold and bureaucratic. "We are sorry, counsel, but this case was closed years ago. The evidence you present is not sufficient to justify a continuance," a court clerk told him in an indifferent tone. Marcos left the courtroom frustrated. The feeling of facing an insurmountable wall was daunting, but he was not ready to give up. He decided to turn to the media. If he could not get justice in court, perhaps public pressure could make a difference. He contacted a trusted journalist, Laura Suarez, who had covered several cases of corruption and judicial abuses. Laura listened attentively as Marcos told her the details of the case and the suspicions surrounding Alberto Ruiz. "This is big, Marcos, but it's also dangerous." "Are you sure you want to go ahead?" Laura asked. "I have no choice. Miguel deserves a chance, even if it's minimal," Marcos replied firmly. Laura agreed to publish an initial article highlighting the doubts surrounding the case and mentioning key names. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, several media outlets began to pick up the story, attracting public attention. However, the system's response was just as swift. The director of the penitentiary summoned Marcos for an urgent meeting. When he arrived, he was greeted with hostile glances and an atmosphere of palpable tension. "Counsel, your interference is causing trouble. The system has already decided your client's fate, and we will not allow you to discredit our work with baseless accusations," the director told him harshly. "I am not discrediting anything. I am asking that the possibility of an error be considered." "Isn't that what justice should guarantee?" Marcos replied, trying to remain calm. "This is not a philosophical debate. You have to stop your actions or you will face legal consequences," the director threatened, before standing up and ending the meeting. That evening, Marcos returned to his office, tired but more determined than ever. The threats and resistance only confirmed that he was touching a nerve. Laura's post had achieved what he had hoped, opening a public debate. He received messages of support from activists and lawyers, but also warnings from anonymous people who insisted that he drop the case. Meanwhile, Miguel remained in the penitentiary, ever closer to his execution. Marcos knew that his time was running out and that he needed something more forceful to bring about change. Finally, he decided to try a risky move: call a press conference to expose everything he knew. With Laura's help, he organized the event where he would present the evidence he had collected and openly accuse Alberto Ruiz of being behind the crime. On the day of the conference, with cameras and microphones facing him, Marcos felt the tension in the air. It was his last card, a desperate act that could change everything or sink him completely. "I am here today to talk about an innocent man who is about to be executed for a crime he did not commit," he began, his voice firm. Marcos's press conference had an immediate impact. The lawyer's statements reverberated like a bombshell in the media, exposing details that had never before come to light. The name of Alberto Ruiz, openly mentioned as the possible mastermind of the crime, began to appear in headlines throughout the country. However, the effect was twofold. While some sectors of society applauded Marcos's courage in taking on a seemingly corrupt system, others, led by figures close to power, questioned his ethics and accused the lawyer of seeking media attention. That same afternoon, Marcos received a call that he had anticipated, but that still made him uneasy. The voice on the other end of the phone was unmistakable. "Marcos, I thought you were smarter," Alberto Ruiz said in a calm, almost mocking tone. "The only mistake I made was not doing my research before," Marcos replied coolly, maintaining his composure. "What do you hope to achieve with all this? You know you don't have enough evidence. You are risking your career, your reputation, and believe me, much more than that." Marcos gripped the phone tightly, feeling anger mixed with adrenaline. "Miguel doesn't deserve to die for something you did. No matter what you say or do, I'm going to get to the bottom of this." Alberto let out a short laugh. "You have guts, I admit. But I warn you, you are playing with fire. You don't know what I'm capable of." The call ended abruptly, leaving Marcos with a knot in his stomach. He knew that Alberto was not a man to make empty threats. The pressure was beginning to intensify, and the consequences of his actions were not long in coming. The next day, an anonymous article appeared in several media outlets, accusing Marcos of having manipulated evidence in past cases and suggesting that he was funded by organizations with dark interests. Although it was baseless, the article was enough for some people to start questioning him. He also received an official letter from the Bar Association, informing him that a disciplinary investigation had been opened against him. Alberto's strategy was clear: to publicly discredit him and force him to drop the case. Marcos met with Laura in her office, trying to plot the next step. "Alberto is playing dirty, as I expected, but we can't stop now," he said, as he checked the documents over and over again. "We need something more compelling, something that connects him directly to the crime." Laura replied thoughtfully. "Have you considered talking to anyone else who may have worked for him? Maybe there is someone willing to talk." The suggestion prompted Marcos to contact former employees and partners of Alberto. However, most were reluctant to cooperate, fearing retaliation. One of them, who asked to remain anonymous, admitted that Alberto had a history of solving problems in his own way, but could not provide concrete evidence. Meanwhile, Miguel remained in prison, ever closer to execution. On a new visit, Marcos told him about Alberto's advances and threats. "I knew this was going to happen," Miguel said with a sad smile. "Alberto has always been like this. But it doesn't matter what he does. You're doing the right thing, Marcos, and that's all that matters." Miguel's words strengthened Marcos's resolve, but also increased his anguish. He knew that time was running out and that despite his efforts, the odds were not in his favor. That night, as he reviewed his notes once more, an idea began to form in his mind. If Alberto was pushing so hard, perhaps it was because he knew there was something Marcos hadn't yet discovered. Maybe the key was to follow that trail to the end, no matter the risks. Marcos knew he was in a race against time and a powerful enemy, but he couldn't turn back. Miguel depended on him, and the truth was too close to give up now. The atmosphere in the prison visiting room was more tense than ever. Miguel was waiting for Marcos, sitting in the same chair as always, but his posture was different. There was a mixture of resignation and urgency in him. He knew that time was running out. Marcos arrived with a folder under his arm, loaded with questions. He had gathered fragments of evidence and suspicions, but something crucial was still missing to unravel the truth. Miguel's full confession. "I need you to tell me everything, Miguel. No reservations, no omissions. Every detail matters now more than ever," Marcos said as he sat down in front of him. Miguel nodded slowly, as if he was gathering strength to open a wound he had kept closed for years. "Okay, I'll tell you everything, but you must understand that what I did out of loyalty. Alberto wasn't always the man you know now. When we were young, he was someone I could trust. When he asked me to take the blame, I thought I was returning a favor." Miguel began to recount how, weeks before the murder, Alberto had come to him in desperation. He had had a violent altercation with the victim, who was extorting him with information that could destroy his career. According to Miguel, Alberto confessed to him that he saw no other way out than to eliminate him. "I tried to convince him to find another solution, but Alberto always had to be in control. He told me that his mind was already made up and that he just needed to make sure someone took the blame. He offered me money, protection for my family, everything I could need. But I didn't do it for that. I did it because I felt I owed him something," Miguel explained, his voice thick with emotion. "How did it all end that night?" Marcos asked, making a mental note of every detail. "Alberto called me after he did it. He asked me to go to the place to get rid of anything that could incriminate him. It was a mistake. Just when I was there, the police arrived. I never mentioned Alberto, and he made sure there was nothing that could directly connect him to the crime," Miguel said, looking down. Marcos felt a mix of anger and frustration. Miguel's loyalty had sealed his fate, while Alberto continued with his life without consequences. But there was still more he needed to know. "Why didn't you speak up earlier? Why confess all this now, when it's almost too late?" Miguel looked up, tears welling up in his eyes. "Because I can't keep quiet anymore. At first, I thought I could live with the decision I made, but the years here made me realize that the truth matters, even if it comes late. I don't want to die with this burden on my conscience, and maybe if you can expose it, something good will come out of all this." When the clock struck 10 at night, Marcos returned to the prison, determined to be with Miguel in his final moments if he failed to stop the execution. In the visiting room, he found him calm, almost serene. "You tried, Marcos. That's all that matters," Miguel said with a small smile. "I'm not done, Miguel. I won't do it while there's a chance, no matter how small," Marcos replied, taking his hand tightly. As the prison lights glowed in the distance, Marcos knew time was running out, but his fight for the truth was just beginning. Midnight was approaching, and with it, the weight of the final decision. Marcos remained in the prison, clinging to any chance of saving Miguel. The atmosphere was tense, each second feeling like an eternity. Outside, journalists and activists had gathered, clamoring for justice as Miguel's story continued to gain national attention. Inside the courtroom, Miguel seemed calmer than Marcos could have imagined. His serenity contrasted with the anguish that consumed the lawyer. "Marcos, you have done more than anyone would have done. I appreciate everything you tried, but there is no need to keep blaming yourself. I made this decision a long time ago," Miguel said, his voice firm but full of resignation. Marcos shook his head, his voice cracking with frustration. "I can't accept this, Miguel. It's not fair. I can't let someone like Alberto get away with it while you pay for his crime." Before Miguel could respond, a guard entered the room, interrupting the conversation. "Mr. Marcos, it's time. If you want to accompany him, you must come now." Marcos's throat closed. There was no more time. Despite all his efforts, the machinery of the system moved forward relentlessly. He stood up and accompanied Miguel through the prison corridors, each step resonating like a hammer in his conscience. When they reached the execution room, the atmosphere was cold and solemn. Miguel turned to the chaplain and murmured a few words that Marcos could not hear. Then he turned to the lawyer, with a look that seemed to contain an unexpected peace. "Marcos, don't let this end here. What you did for me matters, and it will continue to matter after tonight. Demand justice, not for me, but for all those who have been silenced," Miguel said before being escorted to the place where he would serve his sentence. Marcos felt a lump in his chest as he watched Miguel take his position. The final minutes were a whirlwind of emotions until the execution was carried out. The impact was devastating. Miguel had given his life, but his sacrifice was not in vain. That same night, as headlines announced the execution of Miguel Hernandez, they also began to question the judicial system. Marcos's press conference, combined with the previous revelations, had unleashed a wave of outrage. Protests began to form in the streets, demanding a deeper investigation into Alberto Ruiz and the flaws in Miguel's trial. Marcos returned to his office, exhausted and consumed by guilt. Yet amidst the pain, a spark of determination continued to burn within him. Miguel had confided his truth to him, and now it was up to him to make sure the sacrifice was not in vain. Weeks passed, and public pressure finally paid off. An independent commission was formed to reopen the case. Alberto Ruiz, who until then had remained silent, was forced to face uncomfortable questions. Although his lawyers tried to divert attention, the accumulated evidence began to close in on him. For Marcos, the road to justice was just beginning. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to dedicate every resource and every moment to exposing the truth. Miguel was dead, but his story became a symbol of the fight against a system that so often failed the most vulnerable. On the day of Miguel's funeral, Marcos stood in front of the small crowd that had come to say goodbye. Activists, friends, and people touched by his story were there, holding signs demanding justice. Today we say goodbye to a man who sacrificed everything out of loyalty. But his story does not end here. Miguel will not be forgotten, and his fight will continue to inspire us. "I promise that I will not rest until those responsible face the truth," Marcos said, his voice cracking but full of conviction. As he left the cemetery, the lawyer looked up at the sky. Miguel was gone, but his legacy would live on. Now more than ever, Marcos was determined to honor him, fighting against the injustices that had condemned him. The story of Miguel and Marcos teaches us a powerful lesson. Sometimes the truth comes at a high cost, but justice is worth every sacrifice. It forces us to reflect on our own ability to act in the face of injustice and to ask ourselves, what would we have done in Marcos's place? Would we have the courage to stand up to a corrupt system and risk everything for the truth? Miguel's loyalty and Marcos' determination inspire us to never turn our backs on what is right, even when the world seems to be against us. Click on the video on the screen to continue this fascinating journey of self-discovery and explore stories that challenge you to reflect on your own decisions. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue receiving content that inspires you, challenges you, and motivates you to act. See you in the next video.